Are you going to help me with this? Hi everyone. I am so glad to be doing this Q&A as a just big thank you for your beautiful support of the Heart is a Cauldron podcast and Patreon thus far. Talons is with me here today. Before we get into your questions, I did want to give a quick heads up about the Patreon. I've really simplified the structure there and condensed it down to the magic that people were really responding to the most. So, really, just two main tiers in there now. One is at the $5 level, which helps me keep the podcast going because it's many, many days of work for each episode. But your $5 isn't just a thank you. You, in return, get a pretty awesome many-paged praxis guide. And so this includes things like altar ideas, tarot spreads, rituals that you can do, all centered around the lunations themes, which of course are always universal and kind of timeless as well. So you can touch back into them whenever you need. At the $16 level, you of course get the praxis guide, but also you receive a monthly guided journey, which is one of my absolute favorite things to do in the world. I really love leading journeys, and so I'm so overjoyed to be offering that to more folks now. And you'll also get a bonus lesson, so either a worksheet or a PDF that will guide you through a deeper dive into one of the healing or magical practices of the month. And so these might draw from my coaching practice or from studying Tibetan Buddhist psychology, or from my own personal magical journey and the beautiful teachers that I've worked with in that realm as well. So I hope you'll check out the Patreon and see what's a right fit for you. And thanks for continuing to support this work. It means so, so much. So thank you for the trust that you put in me with some of these really tender questions. I really want to honor that. And so, of course, I do want to, hey, Tansy, come here. I do want to give the caveat that, I don't see myself as a master teacher or guru or anything like that. And so I'm just sharing some things that are in my heart today. A lot of this is always evolving for me. And I hope that this just sparks some ways for you to touch into your own wisdom around this and your own answers to these questions. So with that, the first question was, how do I define love? And this felt so serendipitous because I realized that I have such an easy, free-flowing outpouring of love for the world, and yet not so much towards myself. So this question really helped me in exploring that. So thank you to the person who asked. So how do I define love? My today working version of this is to love is to see, acknowledge the divine in another, because I truly do believe that each of us is holy. And so when we love something, it's to, really honor that divinity. And I like this as a working definition because it encompasses the moments when we, look at another being and we feel this total outpouring of affection and care, right? Because we recognize the things that are just so magical and sacred about this other being. And, it just helps that affection flow. But this definition also helps me in cases when I maybe need to set boundaries, right? You can, as they say, love someone and still tell them no, or still put space between you, if that's really what's going to be healthy for you and the other at the end of the day. You can acknowledge that someone is sovereign and has at least that speck of divinity in them, and know that for whatever reason it might be, that it might not be right for you to interact with that person. So that's what I'm working with right now. I'd really love to hear your definition of love and might ask this on Instagram as well. Next question. What is your hope for our collective future? What keeps you going? That's really been tested this year for all of us, right? I have been holding very close the words of Adrienne Marie Brown this year. Well, and always, but like especially 2020. And I put it here. I'm going to actually read it because I want to make sure to get the words perfectly right. Things are not getting worse. They are getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. And I truly do believe that what we are experiencing now is a massive unveiling. And that's always going to be painful, but it's needed for any real change. And that's whether that's for our own personal journey of growth and healing, or at the collective level as well. And so I am trusting that all of this horror of this year is precipitating long-term change, long-term shifts. And I don't claim to know what those shifts are going to be, but I am trying to figure out what is my version of holding each other close, to go back to that wisdom from Adrienne Marie Brown. And I'd invite all of you, what keeps you going? Maybe you can figure out what your version of holding each other close is. What are the actual tangible actions you can take towards honoring that? So I hope that helps. Thank you for that really, tender question. Okay, this next one, how do we connect with our ancestry? Obviously, I'm so into this question, and that was partly the inspiration for the Heart is a Cauldron podcast and Patreon, of course, because I am so enamored with seeking out these threads that connect so many different earth honoring cultures, both now and in the past. And we all come from earth honoring cultures. Some of us have to go way further back because of, how we've either severed or been severed from that truth. And obviously a lot of people have been severed from their ancestry, their ancestral practices through the harm of colonialism, enslavement, white supremacy. And for white folks whose ancestors have maybe done harm, I so appreciate the people who've spoken to the fact that a lot of the harm that white people have inflicted on others throughout history has often been a result of the trauma we've inflicted on ourselves as well. So I believe reconnecting with ancestry is just so key to the healing we have to do, every one of us. And so with that said, how do we connect with our ancestry? I will answer this question from the perspective of those of us who are children of diaspora or have been severed from our living, relatives who can guide us in this. So for me, for example, I really kind of felt like I was starting from scratch, starting from this place in the dark, and trying to connect with the customs and traditions of my ancestry. One of the best ways that I always kind of start with when answering this question is to connect with the lore of your ancestors. So reading the fairy tales, looking into the oral myths that have been passed down. And the reason I suggest that is because, one, it's a really fun, immersive way to begin to do this research. And two, there's just so much encoded in those kinds of tales. Fairy tales, folklore, myths, legends, they signal what was valued in a culture. They let us know who are the main plants and animal kin that have been central to our communities. They let us know about etiquette, both in relational etiquette with the living world, with things like harvest and our survival, but also etiquette when encountering spirits and the spirit realm. And I've found immense information in literally a 2-page fairy tale, let alone when you start to really dig into more. Another really simple thing I'd love to encourage people to do is to find a tradition from one of the days of the year that were important to your ancestors. So maybe the equivalent of New Year's for your lineage, or maybe how let's just go with New Year's as an example. When you discover what were maybe like the foods, for example, that were typically eaten on the New Year's celebration, or maybe a certain small custom that was done, actually try that out. You can learn so much from actually trying to live the traditions of your ancestors. Even something as simple as a meal that was eaten. Doing that from a mindful place and experiencing it will tell you so much more than potentially hours and hours of research. So do give that a try. The person who asked this question also included this very important layer of just asking me to kind of speak to, there was one other thing I wanted to answer before I tackle the second part of the question. I'm referring to my notes here to make sure I cover everything. I wanted to encourage all of you who are hungry to connect with your ancestry, to ask your ancestors for help. And this can seem like, or this can be, something incredibly simple, like a simple prayer, just speaking with them, letting them know your intention, your desire, your yearning to connect with them. Or you can try out something more elaborate, setting up an altar, doing a ritual, etc. But I include this because I truly believe this was one of the things that helped me the most in my own journey with this. A quick story on this, a personal story. I, have been researching my own ancestry for many years now and the customs around that. And the entire time, from day one, I've been asking my ancestors for help. And years ago, when I first started this, wasn't even sure exactly what I believed about the presence of ancestors, about, can they hear us? What's going on with this? I think it's pretty safe to say that I leaned towards that's not a thing when I started. But I just felt compelled to include that as part of my practice. Because my thinking was that even if there wasn't such a thing as ancestors who could hear us and help us out, that stating that this would be a powerful form of stating my intention and really reinforcing this journey I wanted to go on. So even just from like a mundane level. And so I kept speaking to my ancestors. And over time, this grew into such a powerful practice for me. And more recently, if you fast forward, I just kept following, breadcrumb after breadcrumb until I feel like I was sort of sent a book that I'd been hungry to find, It was a book on the ethnobotany of sacred plants in Slovenia. It was an entire book devoted to the magical perspective surrounding plants and some of the folk traditions surrounding that. And I could not believe that I discovered this book. And then reading this book, I got to one of the last chapters, and there's this tiny little mention of this beautiful ritual that surrounded ferns, and the author mentioned what book that came from. And I found this book, and it was this teeny tiny little self-published book by this guy living today who saw the oral pagan traditions leaving his community and felt really saddened by that, and so wrote this book to try and capture everything he could possibly salvage from the living people of that tradition in his community. And I looked up where he's from, 5 miles away from the town I know my own great-grandparents came from in Slovenia. And it just broke any final doubt that I had about our ancestors wanting to actually help us and being an actual part of our lives. So I just wanted to include that to kind of share some real talk around anyone who's kind of curious about this, but wonders, like, do you have to believe in ancestors and all that stuff? I would encourage you just to explore, and your beliefs will evolve with your journey. Okay, so to get back to the second part of this person's question, they had brought up this point of, could I speak to white people on this journey and why this is a part of anti-racism work, which I just love. And this can absolutely be part of your anti-racism journey. And it's so important for us as folks descended from, European ancestry, to connect with our lineage and those practices, because otherwise we all have this wound, this gap, this hunger for this kind of spiritual nourishment. And when you don't acknowledge that and don't explore it, you are going to feel drawn to, borrowing or stealing from other cultures that might, seem more easily accessible. And so, a lot of people now know about the conversation of, white sage, for example, which is sacred Native American medicine. And many, many Native Americans have spoken on, asked non-native, indigenous to Turtle Island peoples to not use this plant for various reasons. And there are countless herbs that we can use for similar medicine to, I won't get into all the different herbs and things there right now, but it's understandable that, if you're hungry for spiritual connection and you've been sort of severed from that, from your ancestral lineage, you see a bundle of sage in a shop and it's so accessible and you can just buy it, and then suddenly you're doing this spiritual practice. Of course, we're going to feel drawn to that because of this wounding that we feel, but tapping into our ancestry is going to create a much healthier, more expansive foundation for you to continue your spiritual journey. And then hopefully also along the way, awaken us all to some of the harms we need to rectify, either that our ancestors have done or that we ourselves have done. So thank you so much for this question. Okay. I love this next one. I get questions like this one all the time. So if you maybe aren't aware watching this, I am a pansexual femme in a monogamous marriage with a cis hetero man. And so this question is, are you able to share any wisdom or resources for navigating marriage in which one partner identifies as straight and their partner is bi? Yeah, okay. So I won't read their entire question. That's the heart of it. So yes, I get questions like this very much, both on Instagram and even in client work that I've done with folks. So a few things I want to speak to in this. Hopefully we all feel this way, but it's so important to voice that your current relationship status does not dictate your identity, your sexuality. You don't even have to be in any relationship for your sexuality to be valid. So with that said, there are a few things that have been helpful for me. First is spending a lot of time tracking my own internalized homophobia. And especially tracking that kind of inner voice that I've inherited from even like the queer community, that, bisexuality isn't a thing, or you're not queer enough to sort of own certain labels. No one's attacked me personally. These are just narratives that I've noticed that I, again, internalized. And so the first step was really for me to notice that. Even becoming aware of that is such an important first step. I've also, the next thing I would say is to, looking at my notes here. So I have really expanded the idea of what it means to me to express my queerness. So yeah, if I had this definition of expressing my queerness can only mean when I'm literally in bed with someone who's not cishet, then yeah, I could never express my queerness. But when I see my personal queerness as being this beautiful aspect to every facet of my being, then that radically opens up how I can express my queerness. So in my experience, my queerness has informed how I literally even just see and perceive the world. It affects how I engage with, political action. It affects how I write, and how I dress, the art that I engage with. So in that way, I very much feel like I live my queerness. It doesn't matter what my romantic relationship with my partner looks like. That said, in my relationship with my partner, I'm also extremely open about my queerness. This isn't like some facet of myself that I keep hidden, or it's like off to the side, or he just sort of puts up with or something. My husband knows very, very well my personal sexual experience, my desires, and we've worked out our personal way of how I can be vocal and open about that in a way that feels, loving and respectful and healthy for him as well. So I don't care what orientation you are. If you're with someone for a long time, it's not like you're only ever going to have sexual feelings for that one person. So you're going to have to figure out your personal way of owning those feelings and, exploring them in whatever way is right for you and your partner. A couple other things I wanted to mention to this. Something else that's been helpful for me to feel connected to the queer community, especially because of the kind of marriage that I'm in, is to really make sure that I'm actively investing in and supporting queer people and the queer community at large. So I volunteer with the Trevor Project, which is it's a nonprofit organization devoted to a suicide hotline for LGBTQIA youth. So, volunteering is a really great way to feel connected to the queer community. I'm also I love following other queer folks on Instagram, right? So I can really stay connected to and support folks in that way. And then lastly, oh, actually, no, that was it. I touched on everything I wanted to say. So I hope that was helpful. Definitely DM me if you yourself are sort of working with this. I always want to kind of give back to the kindness and generosity I've been shown by the other queer people in my life who have been such amazing teachers and friends in my own path. Oh, and the person asked about resources. Just a couple people I'd encourage you follow on Instagram, the Salty account, Salty World. It's a magazine and media company and Instagram that's all about very awesomely radical queerness, and just following their posts helps me sort of explore my own edges and my own excitements around queerness. So definitely check them out. And I also want to give a shout out to Pavani Moraes, an amazing, I believe, couples therapist if you're looking for someone to actually work with in your marriage. But beyond that, I know they also do one of my absolute favorite podcasts with Spoken Bones, and they're always featuring queer people in that space. So, and Pavani really focuses a lot of their attention on sexual health and creating sexual freedom for oneself. So check them out. Okay, next question. What's your personal position on sex work? I was so happy to get this question because, I think it's always important for us to speak to these things very explicitly. So let me say, I trust sex workers and I honor sex work. So because of my own interests, I would add to that and say, I know there's a long, long history of sacred sex in paganism and religious practices, sacred prostitution, it's sometimes called. So just wanted to mention that fun fact in case some folks weren't aware. But I also, on the other hand, don't want to romanticize sex work. I get that just like any other work or any other industry, it can be rife with exploitation as much with empowerment, which is exactly why I defer to trusting sex workers and to follow those people in that lived experience to know what they need for support and what is the truth for them. So thank you for asking that. And please, if you are a sex worker following the podcast or me on Instagram or whatever, please be welcome. I love you. Oh, and I also had a note to mention this too. One of the reasons I have a just personal love for sex workers is that, as we all know, sex in general is just so suppressed, especially in, Western or particularly American culture. We have lots of deep traumatic roots in Puritanism and, patriarchy. And, my life definitely has been affected by that as well. And so I hands down can say that exploring sex, my sexual desires, my sexual liberation was actually one of the first things that I did in my sort of healing journey, when I was a teenager and becoming a actively sexual being. That was so important to me. And so I just will have a lifelong respect for sex and the role it can play in our healing. So sex workers have a role in that too. And at the very least, can spotlight where we as a culture need to grow, heal, expand. So thanks again for this question. What are your thoughts on life being meaningful and meaningless? This question. I actually was DMing with this person. They gave me a bit more context as well. And they explained, my one friend is Buddhist and very intellectual and existential. They described approaching life with boundless freedom because they felt life was meaningless. Okay. So I don't talk a lot about my study and practice of Buddhism, in part because I don't want to come off as making money from that, appropriating it, right? Like trying to make status from that. But it is a huge part of my life. And so I do want to just give a quick context on that. So I have studied Buddhism and taken certain vows with lineage holders from Nepal and Tibet, as well as from Western teachers who have received empowerment from their teachers, lineage holders in Tibetan Buddhism, to teach other Westerners. And so I absolutely do not claim to be an expert. So I'll just share from, my personal studies. The teaching I have been given about meaningfulness or meaninglessness in life, what this person is probably referring to are the teachings in Buddhism around emptiness. And in the teachings I received, something that was really helpful for me was framing this not as emptiness, but radical openness. So I'm going to share a bit more what I mean on this, but this is an incredibly complex topic. And so if this sparks anything in you, please seek out, lineage holders in Tibetan Buddhism who can really speak from true realization and wisdom. With that said, this idea of radical openness in Buddhism, sometimes called emptiness, this idea that there is no one fixed, static, unchanging core to any being or thing. So an example that is often given is to, picture a rose, let's say, a flower of some kind. At what point in the rose's life cycle could you point to that rose, let's say a rose bush, and say, that's a rose? Maybe, you try to say, it's like when the rose is at its peak and all the flowers are blooming and you can really smell it and it's like actualized its fullest potential. But does that mean that as the rose begins to fade, it's no longer a rose? Or does it mean that when the rose is dormant in winter and has no even leaves, that it's not a rose? And we can do the same sort of mental exercise with the meaning that is placed on a rose. So for one person, they might associate rose with, deep grief because, maybe recently a loved one died and that loved one cultivated roses their whole lives. While another person might see rose as the epitome of love because, their beloved, gifted them a rose on, one of their first dates or something. So all this is to say that, the rose plant exists in this example, but it's totally open in the sense of there's no one essential core you can point to, and, its meaning is really open as well. And the whole point behind this exercise is it teaches us that our mind, our perception, has so much more power and potential than we often give it credit to. And when we can start to live life from this realization, it actually opens up possible meaning, I would say, rather than meaninglessness. And as one of my teachers, Geshe Tenzin Zopa, says, we're not saying that life is an illusion or that this rose, for example, is an illusion. It is illusion-like. And I love that. And so if something is illusion-like, then we have tremendous opportunity to investigate the assumptions and the fears or the past histories that we place upon another person or an object or situation, to investigate that, and then also to choose how we want to actually interact with that situation, that person, that being. One other thing I wanted to say about this, I've seen this kind of nihilism or existentialism, around meaninglessness from people who study Buddhism in a kind of detached way that's not actually working with lineage holders and in the tradition. And I don't know this friend, not saying anything about them. But this is such a good example of why it's so important to connect with truly realized teachers, rather than defaulting on the tendency for a lot of us in the West to, explore something in a sort of detached, consumptive way, like reading some books, for example. And so in the lineage of Tibetan Buddhism that I study and practice, there's something very treasured called the Lam Rim, otherwise called the path to enlightenment. And it's sort of this literal roadmap that one follows in training their heart and mind and spirit towards awakening. And I mention it because in the Lam Rim, before you get to emptiness teachings or radical openness, as my teachers talk about it, you start with compassion, and from really cultivating a compassionate, altruistic aspiration to all you do. So by the time that you get to this idea of radical openness, you have the foundation of compassion to guide you in how you use that radical openness. So you have this motivation to use that openness to liberate yourself and all beings. And so it helps you avoid the trap of nihilism. So yeah, just wanted to share that. And yeah, I hope that was helpful. I love this question. I could go on, but I'll go to the next one. This next question is actually deeply related. So, ritual ideas for creating meaning. Lately, I've been feeling existential dread. I am right there with you. In case that isn't abundantly clear in what I try to be honest about on the podcast and Instagram, etc. I've been feeling a lot of dread this year myself too. So thank you for this. I really bow to you in this question, and I'm with you in it. So sorry about that. The computer froze. Okay, so caveat first. Before I talk about ritual for creating meaning, I just want to say that I hope that all of you are finding ways to create or engage in ritual to be with the dread first. Because another way to think of ritual is simply as a safe container to heal, to, step into a new part of your journey, whatever. And since ritual is a safe container, it's the perfect way to, it's one of many wonderful ways to process grief and dread and all those challenging things. And if we're not processing all the challenging stuff, then there's no amount of ritual that will help us, create meaning or joy or whatever we're looking for. No assumptions about the person asking this question. I just always appreciate opportunities to counsel against spiritual bypassing. So with that said, finding meaning and rituals for that. Finding meaning is often at the heart of many earth-honoring cultures. And so just some suggestions to get you thinking about your own. Because rather than prescribing anything super specific, I want to plant some seeds, some questions for you to create a ritual that will help you explore those questions. So I would invite you to reflect on what your soul's purpose is. What is your soul's purpose? What were you sent here to do? And as a starting point to explore this, if that feels really intimidating, I would invite you to explore first knowing who you are. So what are your values, your core values? What are your gifts? What helps you feel alive in this world? And once you have a sense of truly who you are, because a lot of us don't know that. A lot of us will die before we really know who we are. So that's a bigger ask than it might seem. But once you have a sense of truly who you are, then how can you um, devote your truest self towards helping others? I'm not claiming that that will be your one perfect answer for creating meaning, especially, in a year like this. But I do this kind of inquiry and deep searching with coaching clients of mine and in groups, and it's one of my absolute favorite things to do. And I've really found that these questions open up a lot of direction and guidance for folks. And so certainly reach out if you would like some one-on-one support in that as well. And I also want to say, if you are someone who maybe is already tapped into a sense of your soul's purpose, then if you're in a phase of, seeking out meaning, first, I want to invite you to allow yourself some tenderness and understanding and compassion if you're not feeling connected to that purpose right now. A lot of us aren't. This is just a completely unprecedented year. And so, yes, we want to make sure that we're on track towards our purpose, but it doesn't mean that every breath you take is going to be necessarily devoted to that. And it's okay when you need to take those periods to recuperate, rest, tend yourself, etc. I have a note here to make sure to say of something that came to me as I was reflecting on this, is just that getting through the day can totally be a ritual. And I think especially in 2020, I think we've seen how true that can be. Next question. On the intersection of animism and Buddhism, this person asks, as I reflect on these paths, I sometimes feel that animism is, in a way, more neutral, while Buddhism is more geared towards preventing harm. For example, I see animism acknowledging the cycles of prey and predator, of harm and healing more wholly. And I see Buddhism as trying to minimize the harm done from a very strongly moral standpoint. And I have a sense that these differences are not as dualistic as I'm depicting them here. Okay, really complicated. And again, I'm not an expert, but what I feel called to share on this, I would say yes and no to what you're saying. So here's how Buddhism and animism are extremely similar in what I've encountered. First, at their core, animism and Buddhism share at its, deepest level, interconnectedness. It's a sacred central tenet in both, that our fundamental survival, our happiness, our existence is intimately interwoven with all other beings. So that's something they both share. They also both spend a lot of time focusing on the responsibility that is a natural extension of that interconnectedness, right? So if our existence is interwoven with others, then we have to feel partly responsible for the well-being of others, because that actually in return affects our own well-being. So it really comes from this pretty even just logical place. Both Buddhism and animism, excuse me, can you lay down? Come here. Pansy, lay down. Come on. Hold on a second. Okay. Both Buddhism and animism, in addition to focusing on that responsibility, they both acknowledge that most of us cause a lot of harm. And both have methods for acknowledging the harm that we cause and, in some cases, rectifying that. So, there are rituals in both traditions that I can think of for appeasing the land, let's say, when you want to build a home or a stupa or memorial on top of the land, right? So they share a lot. Yeah, absolutely. Just looking at my notes, what I wanted to say. So the way I'd like to talk today about the difference I've noticed is it's the quality with which we relate to harm. That's different. So in Buddhism, harm should definitely always, always, always be avoided. And in some cases, you take vows to that effect, right? That's why things like vegetarianism are so common among Buddhists. In animism, whether the rites center on atonement or more often gratitude, there is, I've seen this sort of sense of inevitability or acceptance around that. One of my favorite teachers in animism, Daniel Four, just finishing up his awesome practical animism course. If you're interested, check that out. One of the very first lessons he includes in that course is all centered on acknowledging that every single one of us kills to survive. And so his stance on that, which I really appreciated and have adopted myself, is certainly to minimize harm any chance we have. But when harm is caused, say, consuming some vegetables for dinner, or meat or whatever, that we approach that with a spirit of thanks rather than sorry. So, yeah, that's not a very clean answer. It's not, tidy. This is all very complex, but I do believe that animism and Buddhism share more in common than one might think. And I hope that provides a little insight on my experience of the differences too. Last question. My favorite band or musician. Forget like meaning and, existential dread and all that. This was the hardest question because I worked in a record store for 5 years, as a young person. And so I just find this question really evil. So I'm not going to answer who do I think makes the best music, or whatever. I'm trying to answer this question from, what musician has been, my therapist and road trip partner and, random person in the bathroom who gives you the best advice ever. And so with that in mind, I have to say that my favorite musicians, I'll share two, are the same as they were when I was 15, because that's when I first really encountered both of these. And that is Tom Waits and Tori Amos. Yeah. So if you're looking for recommendations of kind of checking their music out, if you're not very familiar or you want to revisit them because you haven't listened in a while, for Tom Waits, I would recommend, my favorite song is Hold On. And oh my God, I'm just getting swept away even just thinking of it. And or the song that played at my wedding, which was Picture in a Frame. And then for Tori, I would recommend either the song Girl or the entirety of the Boys for Paley album. So, this was so much fun. Thank you so much, everyone, for the questions. Thank you for watching this. I hope there were some nuggets for reflecting on your own, like I said before, wisdom. Sending all of you so much love. Please do check out the Patreon if you haven't already, or if you did before, take another look because it's shaping up pretty nicely, I think, and we'd love to have you in there with us. My heart goes with you in the between time. Bye, everyone. Hi. I am back because I completely missed one of my favorite questions from the Q&A, and it came from a beloved friend and early Patreon member, so I just could not include it. So here's the question. Um, As someone who suffers from seasonal affective disorder, I'm wondering how we can, while the days are still long but getting shorter, set ourselves up for continued gratitude, especially since traditional harvest time will be ending in a few months. They had asked this question, I believe, about a month ago. Or even, how do you prepare and care for yourself during the dark half of the year? And I just love this question so much. First of all, my partner and I both have varying levels of seasonal affective disorder as well. I know this affects a lot of people, and if you're listening and that rings true for you, I hope that you're able to find all the support that you need in that. So yeah, this question especially I'm going to focus on of how to prepare for and care for ourselves during the dark half of the year. Something that I realized I was doing sort of intuitively, but didn't articulate until I was preparing for this question, is this idea of treating the seasons like you would any other relationship with an animate being. And so I personally believe that, we live in a living world. And so just like a plantkin is alive to me, so are the seasons themselves alive. And so what I mean by treating the seasons like you would any other relationship. Yes, hey baby boy. Yes, you're a very sweet bear. So what I mean by treating the seasons as you would like any other relationship, this is really an opportunity to get clear about what a season has to offer. And so a starting place is actually, I would suggest to reflect on what the, let's say, winter season means to you. And one note about this, if trying to work with a season as a living being is maybe too abstract, then it can be really beautiful to work with a deity, so like a dark god or goddess from maybe your ancestral lineage. And I'll, of course, be talking about some of those deities of the dark half of the year coming up very soon on the podcast, of course. So yeah, starting from just beginning to understand what the season has to offer, who they are. And when you start to get this sense, you can actually start to build an active living relationship with the season. And what I mean by this is, you can either do this in ceremony or just, quiet meditation. But asking the season or the related deity, again, what their medicine is, ask them how you can best receive and access and benefit from this medicine. Asking what practices they would suggest you engage in to really relate with them in a healthy, beneficial way. You can also do things like create indoor space or find outdoor space where you can sort of be with the essence of the season, either to ask questions like this or to continue to touch in. And as time goes on and you begin to relate in this way, my hope is that you can find some space to begin to shift from solely the place of hardship, but we should always acknowledge that when we're struggling with something like a season, right? But shifting to include, or I should say maybe expand to include, ways that you can actually benefit from this time. Really big caveat there, that's again not to say that seasonal affective disorder isn't real. It totally is. And absolutely, let's be very real about our struggles and what we need to work with that. I hope that's, abundantly clear. One other thing I was reflecting on as I was preparing this answer was, if that practice, that idea of relating to a season as a relationship and trying to understand their medicine and all that stuff, if that feels too far out of reach, whether too abstract or just plain too difficult, you can also do a similar practice, but instead choose an ally that you associate with the bright half of the year, right? The sunny part of the year. So, for example, maybe you have an existing relationship with St. John's wort, and you want to lean on them during the winter months. So it's kind of like choosing almost like the opposite kind of ally to work with during the dark half of the year. And that's totally fine if that's what you need to do. And if that's what you choose, then the practice would be almost identical, right? So just investing in that as a relationship, getting to know truly what their medicine is, what they want to share with you right now, what practices they would encourage you to explore during that. So I know that's not very prescriptive, but I always like to share things that help you find your own way forward. And of course, just because of my own studying and experiences, I just tend to come about these things in terms of relationality. So I do hope that was helpful and gave you some places to begin with that. Please let me know how that journey goes for you. And of course, I'll be right alongside those of you in the Northern Hemisphere heading into that. And like I said, look out for the podcast because we're going to be getting into this in greater detail too. Okay. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.